Hi, everybody. Billy Obenauer here, continuing our series on Bateman and Konopowski's management book, moving into Chapter 8, one of my favorite topics, managing human resources. As we move through this lesson, we're going to start by discussing how companies use human resource management to gain a competitive advantage. All right, then we're going to talk about reasons for recruiting both internally and externally for new hires. We talk about the methods for selecting employees and some HR related laws. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about training and development, and then move on to talk about performance appraisal. All right, then we're going to talk a little bit about reward systems, how we compensate our employees, and finally, we'll wrap up talking about labor unions. Now, human resource management is one of the most important topics that we're going to cover over the course of this series. And I say that as I'm sitting here recording this video in October of 2021 in the middle of what we're calling the Great Resignation. All right. And what we're dealing with here right now is that there's a labor shortage that's impacting businesses and causing them to have to change the way they operate. I drove past a McDonald's around 7:30, 8 o'clock the other night, and it was closed because they didn't have staff. The next morning, around 6:30 in the morning, they were closed for the same reason. This is truly an HR issue here, okay? Because organizations are dealing with the fact that perhaps employees left, perhaps they're unable to hire employees, but they have an issue getting the staffing that they need in the workplace, okay? Now, as we think about human resource management, historically, we've thought about HR as being more of an administrative function. These are the people who process our paychecks, they make sure we get our benefits, and so on and so forth. But human resource management is so much more than that. Right? Human resource management plays a role as both a business partner and a strategic partner to executive management. All right. And this is critical because if we think about this, people are at the core of everything we do in our businesses. Okay. So if we're going to develop new strategies to be successful as an organization, those strategies are going to involve people. And we really need to have human resource managers involved in this so that we can ensure that we not only have enough people to execute our strategies, but that we have enough people who have the right qualifications, the right knowledge, skills, and abilities to support the strategies that we're implementing. Now, part of the reason that human resource management is so important is because people create value for our organizations. Now, if you think about this, our organizations are not charities, right? They're not hiring people to be nice. They're hiring people because people do things that help the organization succeed. Okay, whether we're talking about the CEO of the organization or a cashier, they all provide value for the organization. All right. Now, often we have trouble recognizing what that value is. I once had a student tell me that they didn't think they provided value in their job because all they did was cut up tomatoes. Well, when we got to their job into discussing their position, what they did, what we found was that they were the first stage in food preparation in their business, right? And if they didn't do their job well, everything else in that business was going to be impacted by that. So people create value no matter what type of position they're in the organization. All right, and talent is rare. It's often very hard to find people that do certain things that you're looking for. All right, and good, well chosen, motivated people are difficult to imitate and they can't be replaced by technology. And then finally, if we think about this, we can organize our people. And they're going to help us be very successful in everything that we're trying to do. Now, good human resource management starts with planning. All right, and planning has three stages to it. The first stage we actually refer to as planning. And this is where human resource managers really just need to be in tune with what it is that the company is doing, what are the organization's goals, and so on and so forth. Second stage is programming. And this is where we're going to implement specific activities according to our plan. And then finally, we're going to evaluate the plan to identify whether or not the activities we implemented were successful in helping us achieve our goals. Now we're going to dive into these stages a little bit deeper. As we look at the first stage planning here, we see there are two components to it. First being environmental scanning. So we're going to take a look at understanding our labor markets, our technology, legislation, competition, the economy, and so on and so forth. All right. And then the other component to planning is HR planning. All right. And this is where we have to understand our demand forecast, our internal labor supply, our external labor supply, and job analysis. All right. When we look at the programming stage here, some of the activities that we'll be implementing include recruitment, selection, issues pertaining to diversity and inclusion, training and development, performance appraisal, implementing reward systems, and dealing with labor relations. All right, now as we evaluate the plan, we'll look at metrics such as productivity, quality, innovation, satisfaction, turnover, absenteeism, and even health. Now, in the previous slide, we mentioned forecasting, and you might have been sitting there wondering what exactly that is. All right, so we start with what's called a demand forecast, and this is where we determine how many and what types of people we need. Okay, so when I was managing, we would do our demand forecast by forecasting our sales. Okay, so I'd have to predict what I thought my sales were going to be 3 months out, and I would predict them for my business and then break that down by department. All right, and each department had different needs based upon its sales. So I had some departments where sales required a lot of people and some departments where sales required fewer people. All right. I would have to break down my sales forecast by department, and then we had a specific algorithm that converted those forecasted sales into forecasted labor hours. All right. Now, once I forecasted my demand, that was my demand forecast. Once I forecasted my demand, we then would look at our labor supply forecast. All right. And this would tell us how many people and what type of people we have available. So we'd look at our current staff and see what we had in our current staff. Do we have enough people to meet the needs that we just forecast for 3 months out? Or are we going to need to hire? Do we have too many people? Okay. So these are the types of things we would look at. And if there was a mismatch between the demand forecast and the labor supply forecast, we would have to reconcile that. All right. So if we didn't have enough people to meet the demand forecast, all right, if our labor supply forecast indicated that we were not going to have enough people, then we might have to hire. All right. If it indicated that we were going to have too many people, we might have to look into laying off. We might have to look into flexing down some of our part time hours, but we would have to come up with a solution to make sure that in 3 months, when we look at any changes in our labor demand, that we're going to be prepared to match those changes. Now, perhaps the most important function that human resource managers will contribute to is something called a job analysis. And this is our tool for determining what's done on a given job and what should be done on that job. And job analysis has been referred to as the basis for human resource management. And that's because it contributes to our job descriptions, which describe the essential tasks and duties associated with performing a job. It also contributes to our job specifications, which describe the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed to perform a job. All right. Now, job analysis should be done fairly routinely. And the reason for that is that jobs are always changing. So I'm sitting here in 2021. I'm an academic professor. I use a lot of different technology in my classroom. I manage my classes through a learning management system. Right. Technology is very big in what I'm doing. All right. But if I go back to when I was in undergrad a little over 20 years ago, we hardly had any technology that we were interacting with. All right. Email was just beginning to take off. We had just learned about instant messenger. All right. We didn't really have any type of computer functioning that we were engaging in our classes. So if you think about what a job description or job specification for a professor would have looked like back when I was an undergrad, it's probably very different from what we would look at today, because today we would need more technological aptitude than we would need back over 20 years ago. And that's a perfect example of why it's so important for us to continually engage in job analysis and update our job descriptions and our job specifications in order to make sure they're accurate. Now, once we've forecasted our labor demands, our labor supply, and identified what positions we need to hire for and used our job analysis to better understand what these positions look like, it's time for us to recruit some employees. All right. And recruitment is the development of a pool of applicants for jobs in an organization, or in other words, finding people who can do the job where we have a need. All right. And there are two types of recruitment that we're going to talk about here. The first type is called internal recruiting. And this is where we're finding people within the organization who we think can meet the needs of our open positions. And there are some advantages with internal recruiting in that we understand the employees, we know them, we have more complete information about internal recruits than we do about external recruits or people who are outside the organization. All right, also, when we're engaged in internal recruiting, the employees really understand the culture of the organization. They understand what's required for different positions within the organization. So it might be a little bit easier to find a good match. Now, one of the things we have to be concerned with when we consider internal recruiting is that this is really only for positions that are a little bit higher in the organizational chain of command. The reason for this is that we can't recruit internally for entry level positions because people aren't going to move down the chain of command. They're not going to move to a lower rank in order to fill entry level positions. Now that we've established that internal recruiting can't meet all of our needs, it's important that we pay some attention to external recruiting or bringing in people from outside the organization. All right, this can help inspire some innovation and provide us with different perspectives on how it is that we need to do business. Often, organizations that solely promote from within can lack perspectives that those outside the organization can bring to us. All right, at one point in my career, I went to a company where I found that pricing on a certain product did not seem to be in line with the marketplace. And the company had been pricing against a top competitor, but what they didn't understand was how other competitors were pricing this product. Because of my experiences outside the organization, I was able to show them how other competitors were pricing this and implement some changes. Now, if I had been an internal recruit, I might not have had that insight. I might not have been able to provide that knowledge to my organization. So, how do we find people outside the organization? We can use tools like internet job boards, company websites, employee referrals. Now, we want to be careful with employee referrals because while our employees may have a great idea as to who's going to fit in with our organizational culture, there is a little bit of a problem in that people often interact with others who are similar to them. All right, so we can have a little bit of a disparate impact in terms of discrimination when we rely solely on employee referrals. And here's what I mean by this. As I'm recording this video, I'm 41 years old. Okay. I don't hang out with a lot of 20-year-olds. I don't hang out with a lot of 70-year-olds. All right. Most of the people who I interact with are somewhat closer to my age. Now, if my organization was relying on people like me for employee referrals, all right, what might happen is we might not necessarily get a lot of 70-year-old applicants because people like me don't know a lot of people who are in that age range, and we wouldn't necessarily have people to refer there. It wouldn't be that I have a problem with people who are 70 years old. I don't have a problem with people who are that age, but I just simply wouldn't know people to refer there. So when we rely on employee referrals, we do open up the door to potentially having a disparate impact in terms of discrimination against other potential applicants. All right. Some other tools that we can look at here is we can look at newspaper advertisements. Although newspaper advertisements are declining and we often see them in conjunction with internet job boards, purchased as a package. All right, we can look at college campus recruiting. College campuses can be a great place to recruit for our organizations because people on campuses are getting training in things that we're looking for. So, for example, if you were recruiting for a hospital, all right, recruiting on a college campus where there's a medical school would be a great opportunity for you. All right, we can look at networking sites such as LinkedIn, and we can also look at hiring an employment agency to help us fill the gaps. Now, once we've engaged in recruiting applicants, we're going to go ahead and try to choose some qualified applicants from our applicant pool to hire into the organization. And this process is called selection. Now, some key tools that we'll use in the selection process are job applications and resumes. And the key difference between applications and resumes is that with applications, the employer will determine the information that needs to be provided by candidates. And with resumes, the information that's provided is determined by the candidate. Okay, now When we look at job applications and we think about the information that we're going to require here, we have to make sure that we ask questions in a way that is clear to candidates. So, for example, if we have a question on our application and it asks the highest degree earned, how are college students going to reply to that? Are they going to put the degree that they'll have at the time they would start the job, or are they going to put the degree that they have now? If we're not clear on that, we might get a variety of different responses. And then if we've set up an applicant tracking system or an electronic system that is going to filter people out automatically, we might accidentally filter out some really great candidates. The other thing that you want to be careful of with your application is don't ask too many questions and don't ask questions that you don't really need the answers to. Because if your application is too cumbersome, you might actually lose some candidates who don't want to fill out the entire thing. Now, another tool in the selection process that we need to be aware of is the interview. And the interview is unfortunately known for being one of the worst predictors of job performance that's out there, but it is something that we need to be aware of because it is used very, very frequently. All right, and one of the least reliable interviews that we can engage in is an unstructured interview. And this is an interview where the interviewer pretty much just asks whatever they want. All right. And there's not necessarily a rationale behind what's discussed or what's asked. When I was younger, I remember going through an interview where the interviewer and I basically spent the entire time talking about our kids and our families. And then he hired me afterwards. All right. And it ended up being a pretty good fit. But I remember after the interview, thinking, what in the world does this person know about my ability to do this job after this discussion? All right. So, because of some of the problems that we see in the unstructured interviews, particularly the fact that they can be prone to bias, all right, many organizations are trending towards what we call a structured interview. And this is where the interviewer asks all the applicants the same questions and people are scored on their responses to each question. Right? And there's two different types of structured interviews that we'll talk about here. The first one is a situational interview. And in a situational interview, we tell you, imagine you were in this certain type of situation. What would you do? How would you respond to this? Okay, basically, it's an interview where you respond to hypothetical situations. All right, then we have a behavioral description interview. And this one here, we ask you questions like, tell me about a time that you did this. All right, now it's very important that if we're going to be conducting structured interviews, that we think about which one of these interview types is most appropriate. All right. So at one company I worked at, we actually used behavioral description interviews for entry level employees. Now, this is a little bit problematic because the entry level employees didn't have much work experience. So when we're asking them, tell me about a time that you did something, they don't actually have the experiences to respond to here. So in this case, a situational interview might have been much more appropriate because they could have thought about what they would do in a situation. They just simply didn't have the lived experience to tell us about what they have done. All right. Another problem with behavioral description interviews is that sometimes employees or candidates don't necessarily remember things that they've done. So I remember interviewing one of my employees for a promotion at one point, and we were engaged in a behavioral description interview. And I kept asking, tell me about a time that you did this. Tell me about a time that you did this. And we had about four questions in a row where the employee really didn't have great responses. And I was sitting there thinking, I know times that the employee has done this. I wish she would just give me one of these examples that I'm thinking of, but she didn't. And that was a little bit problematic because how do we score this interview? All right, I'm sitting there with my HR manager, and we're both saying the same thing. We know that this person has experiences that would score very well on this interview guide, but they didn't actually discuss them. So, what's the ethical way for us to score this interview? And that's another one of the problems that you can run into with the behavioral description interview. Now, some other selection methods that we might use include a reference check. And with a reference check, what happens is basically we ask our candidates to provide us with a list of people who we can call for a reference. Now, since the candidates are providing us with the list, these are people who we basically should expect to say good things. So, as we make our reference checks, we're not necessarily looking for whether or not what we hear is positive or negative, but we're looking to see what types of examples, what types of experiences we learn about. All right. We can also engage in background checks. And background checks might involve something like a credit check. They might involve looking at a criminal history if that's job relevant. It also could involve a social media check, an internet search, and so on and so forth. All right. Many organizations also conduct personality tests to see if people are a good fit with the organization or to better understand how people like to work. All right. One of the keys, though, if you are using personality tests, is you should be able to demonstrate that the personality tests are in some way, shape, or form related to job duties. Some organizations are still engaging in drug testing. All right. We have to be careful with drug testing, though, because laws are changing around drugs, right? So, in some organizations in the past, testing positive for marijuana would disqualify a candidate. But as marijuana becomes legal, as laws are changing around marijuana, we may need to rethink policies like that. All right. Some organizations use cognitive ability tests, and they may test math skills, they may test reasoning, they may test verbal ability. Again, these can be very helpful, but they should be job relevant. Right. So if I'm hiring a forklift driver, it probably does not matter to me too much if they understand the definition of gratuitous. Okay. However, if I'm hiring somebody to write for my website, I may want somebody who's going to have strong verbal ability, and that would be job relevant. All right. We'd also have people engage in performance tests, and we might use an assessment center or a place that specializes in performance tests to do this. Or and there are a variety of different performance tests out there. So we may be looking for specific skills. As managers, we used to have to conduct something called an in-basket exercise as part of our selection process. And what the in-basket exercise did was it gave us a whole bunch of fictional memos. They asked us to organize our day based upon these fictional memos. And what this performance test did was it helped them to understand the processes that we went through as we were planning. All right, and then finally, we can have integrity tests. Although organizations can't really use lie detectors anymore, there are other types of integrity tests that do get incorporated into the selection process. I've seen organizations ask the same question multiple ways in an application to see if people are consistent in how they respond to the question, and so on and so forth. Now, as we talk about our selection methods, it's very important that they have high reliability and high validity. What do these terms mean? Well, reliability basically deals with getting consistent scores over and over and over again. All right, we've all probably had a bathroom scale at one point in our life where we get on the scale and at one point it says, maybe I weigh 200 pounds. And then the next time I get on, it says I weigh 205. And the next time I get on, it says I weigh 195. Well, I'm getting different scores each time from that scale. It's low on reliability. Sometimes the same thing will happen with our employment tests. All right. A great example of how this can happen is sometimes we have different managers evaluating candidates. All right. And if how a candidate is evaluated is going to be contingent upon who the manager is that's evaluating them, then our selection process is going to be low on reliability. All right. Now, validity deals with the accuracy of the selection test. So, is the test really doing what it's supposed to? And there's two types of validity we're going to consider here. First one being criterion related validity. And this is whether or not a test is actually measuring something that's going to help predict job performance. All right. So, for example, if you were trying to become a police officer, you'd probably have to do a test where you had to do push ups and sit ups and run a mile and a half. All right. Many departments still require this. And there's been a lot of questions about whether or not that really predicts your ability to be a police officer. Those questions pertain to criterion related validity. All right, now our content validity deals with whether or not the tests are accurately measuring what they're out to measure. All right. So if we're trying to see if somebody has expertise in a specific area and we administer a test to see if they have expertise, that expertise, if it's related to the job, would have criterion related validity. But if the test wasn't accurately measuring their expertise, then it would lack content validity. Now, we've been focused on reconciling our demand forecast and our labor forecast and having a need for more labor. But sometimes what we'll find is that we have an overage of labor. All right. And then we have to reduce the amount of labor we have available. One way to do that is through a layoff. And a layoff is where we let go of multiple employees at the same time. All right. Layoffs often can be the result of economic downturns or problems within the organization. And it's critical when we think about layoffs that we try to do all of our layoffs at once. We don't want to have a series of layoffs that adds stress for our employees and helps contribute to something called survivor syndrome, or a situation where employees are stressed by the extra work they have to take on. They're anxious about the potential for them to be laid off, and so on and so forth. And an example of that would be back in 2008, 2009 timeframe in the recession. I was at a company that had multiple rounds of layoffs, about 4 rounds of layoffs before the company shut down. I was let go in the fourth round of layoffs, and on the day that I was let go, there were employees who were in the office who were crying and hugging people who were left. And at one point, I found myself, a person who had just been laid off, consoling somebody who had not been laid off, somebody who was staying. I remember giving this person a hug and saying, "Hey, everything's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. Everybody's going to be okay." And that's because this person had survivor syndrome. They were stressed about what was to come. They were stressed about the work that they were going to have to do. They were stressed about whether or not they were going to have a job. And that was a result of having so many rounds of layoffs. Now, sometimes we'll just have to let go of one employee for either a performance issue or a code of conduct issue or something of that nature. And when this happens, there are a few different things that we want to consider. All right. We want to make sure that what we're doing is legal. And often we don't have too many issues there because most states are employment at will states, which basically means that an employee has a right to leave an employer whenever they want to, and an employer has the right to terminate an employee whenever they want to. Okay. Now, that does not cover issues of discrimination and things of that nature. But what it does mean is that you don't always need a great just cause to get rid of someone. All right. I'm not advocating that you fire people for no reason, but you should be aware of what employment at will means. All right. We do want to make sure that we are engaging in progressive discipline when possible. And what that means essentially is that what we're doing is we're giving people warnings, and then warnings will escalate. They'll eventually get a final warning before they finally get to a termination. Okay, and a great little rule of thumb with progressive discipline is to follow McGregor's hot stove rule. And I've got another video related to that here on my YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to give that a look. But in summary, what the hot stove rule says is, if somebody reaches out and touches a stove, we're all going to get the same burn from that stove, right? And we want that to be the way that we treat our employees, okay? If somebody's going to get disciplined for something, everyone should get disciplined if they engage in that behavior. If somebody's going to get fired for behavior, everyone should get fired if they engage in that behavior, and so on and so forth. All right. And then as we let go of our employees, it's critical that we engage in what's called a termination interview. And in termination interview, we're basically going to have a little discussion with the employee to let them know what's happening and what they can expect moving forward. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here on the next slide. Now, a few key things that you want to think of when you are letting someone go is, for starters, tell them right away what's going on. All right. Firing someone is very uncomfortable. Even if you don't like a person, we rarely want to take away their livelihood, right? Firing someone is the worst. All right. But sometimes we have to do it. And when we do it, we owe the person the respect of just telling them what's happening up front. The first time I ever fired someone as a manager, I had such trouble with it that the other manager who was in the room with me had to take over because they said, "This is taking absolutely too long. We need to just tell this employee what's happening." All right. You want to express some appreciation for the employee if you can, and that's really just treating the person with interpersonal justice, treating them well. All right. Don't allow any time for debate during the session. All right. Person may not agree with you about your assessment of their performance. They may try to argue with you about it. And if they do, just simply say something to the effect of, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but this decision is not changing." Okay. And last, I'm just going to touch on, don't make personal comments to somebody. Okay. You don't want to be in there and insulting somebody, saying, "Hey, you're not a very hard worker," or "You didn't do a good job here." We want to be quick, we want to be to the point, and we want to be respectful. All right. The final thing that we want to make sure that we do is we want to make sure people know what they can expect. Can they expect a letter from our organization with their final paycheck, with their benefits info, all that type of thing? Now, there are many laws that do have some jurisdiction over employment, such as the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination Act. All right, these are all laws that you need to be familiar with as a human resource manager. We need to make sure that we're complying with them and that we're not discriminating against people. But one of the most common reasons that we see for discrimination cases in the workplace is something called an adverse impact, or in a legal term, disparate impact. And what an adverse impact or disparate impact is it's a situation where a seemingly neutral employment policy actually has a discriminatory impact on a group of people. All right. So one of the cases that I use when I teach an HR course shows a company that had a rule against wearing any type of headwear in the workplace. Somebody applied for a job there, they were denied the job because they had headwear on, but the headwear was related to their religion. All right. The person ended up filing a complaint with the EEOC, who then sued the company on behalf of the job applicant. All right, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court found was that it was, in fact, discrimination based upon religion. All right. And what they said was, while the policy wasn't necessarily intended to discriminate based upon religion, because there are some religions that involve wearing headwear, having a policy that prohibits headwear has a disparate impact on people of those religions. Now, for those employees who do stay on with us, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to engage in either training or development. All right. And the key differences between training and development are that training tends to be mandatory, whereas development tends to be voluntary. And that's because training is based upon the needs of your current position, and development is based upon your career or future positions that you're going to engage in. When done well, training can be highly beneficial for your organization, but doing it well involves four phases. We start with a needs assessment. This is where we try to identify people who need training, jobs that people need training for, what types of areas they need training in, and so on and so forth. If you put people into training that they don't need, they're not going to be engaged in it, and you're going to impact their job satisfaction. Once we've identified the training that's needed, we need to go ahead and design the program. Then we need to make decisions about delivery methods. All right, what do I mean by that? Well, we can have classroom training, we can have online training, we can have simulations, we can have hands-on training. And you have to think about what type of skills are we trying to learn and which is most appropriate, right? So for forklift training, I used to have a lot of hands-on training involved in that because you're not going to learn to ride a forklift from a book. Okay. When we did fire extinguisher training, hands-on training would have been great, but it also would have been a mess. So we used a simulation. All right. Training related to different products and product knowledge, that often could be an electronic training or a classroom training. All right. It really, the method that you're going to use is going to depend upon what it is that you're trying to teach people. And then finally, you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of the training. All right. And then based upon that evaluation, you're going to modify the training for the future. There are a variety of different types of training that our employees will engage in. All right, so the first one they'll ever probably engage in is our orientation training, and this is where we bring our new employees into the company and we help teach them about policies, procedures, and things of that nature. Really, the goal with the orientation training is to make sure that when we put people into their jobs, they're going to be in a position where they have enough knowledge that they're able to succeed. Okay. Then we also have team training, and this is where we might teach people about skills for working with others. We might talk to them about perspectives, or we might put them in a situation where they have to work in a team and work through some problems. Many organizations are also recognizing the importance of diversity training. And diversity training will focus on things like recognizing and responding to bias in the workplace, cross cultural communication, and managing a diverse workforce. And there's also management development programs. And this can be to help new or experienced managers, help them become prepared for their next position. So, as a manager, I went through a variety of different types of development programs. I've been through retreats where I would say go to a different city for say 3 days and be in trainings in a building rented out by my company where we would go through a variety of different presentations and interactions and so on and so forth. Or there were times that they would take a whole bunch of high potential managers and send them out to a location and say, here's the task that we have. Maybe we're opening up a new location, but we want this group to work together to come up with a plan to make this happen and execute it. Those are both examples of different types of management development programs. Another important human resource management task is the performance appraisal, right? And this is where we're going to assess an employee's job performance. And this has two purposes, and the purposes can kind of be in conflict from time to time. Purposes are administrative and developmental. Right? And the administrative purpose deals with making sure that we have a record of having communicated with the employee about their performance. It also deals with being able to identify better who should be up for promotion, who should get certain raises, and so on and so forth. The developmental portion of the performance appraisal deals with trying to move our employees forward, trying to prepare them for their next position. Now, sometimes these can go hand in hand, right? Because if I'm doing a performance appraisal and the employee is outstanding, we've gone ahead, we've given them the raise that they deserve based upon their outstanding performance. We've talked about future job opportunities, and now we're working into developmental things. Everything is going very smoothly. But if the employee is not performing well and maybe I'm rating them as needs improvement, all right, they might be resistant to that rating. They might not necessarily buy into their whole performance appraisal. And then that makes the developmental aspect of the performance appraisal a little bit more difficult to execute. Now, there are many different types of performance appraisals, but they really can be categorized into three broad categories. The first one being trade appraisals. And with a trade appraisal, what we do is we basically evaluate people on characteristics or traits. We'll rate them on a scale of 1 to 4, scale of 1 to 5, scale of 1 to 7, something of that nature. So maybe we're rating things such as your product knowledge or your sales ability or your customer service level, things like that. Now, the challenge that we can have with a trade appraisal is that these are very, very subjective, okay? Because these are broad topics that we tend to use. So they can be very subjective in nature. And what that allows is that allows for there to be bias in the process, okay? One category that can help address that is a behavioral appraisal. And with a behavioral appraisal, what we're going to do is we're going to rate specific job behaviors. Okay. These are a little bit more objective because we're talking about specific behaviors. But the challenge with behavioral appraisals is there's only so many behaviors that we can actually put onto an appraisal, right? So maybe we pick 10, 12, 15, even 20. 20 would be a lot, but maybe we get 20 different behaviors. Well, these are going to become the behaviors that our employees focus on. And if there are other behaviors that are related to or important to their job, they may not give them as much attention because they recognize that they're not going to be evaluated on those behaviors, and those behaviors aren't going to really impact what their annual raises are or anything of that nature. All right, and then finally we have results appraisals. Okay, and results appraisals are great when you have objective results that you can associate with a job. So for a manager, you might give them a results appraisal based upon their annual revenue or their net profit. For a salesperson, you might give them a results appraisal based upon the sales generated. Or we also can do results appraisals based upon management by objective. And management by objective involves taking an employee and their boss and working to come up with a series of goals that the employee is going to meet, agreeing on those goals, and then evaluating the employee on those goals in the following review cycle. Now, in the previous slide, we talked about behavioral appraisals, and what we have here is an example of the bars or behaviorally anchored rating scale. All right, that we're going to take a look at. And the bars basically looks at different behaviors, and it kind of lays out this is what a 1 would be, this is what a 2 would be, this is what a 3 would be, and so on and so forth. And here we're talking about quality related behaviors. But what's interesting about this and what can be a challenge with the bars is what happens if we have an employee who views quality as costly, but also blames others for the absence of quality? Well, is that person a 3 here, or are they a 1? Or do you take these two things and average them and make them a 2? That's an example of a challenge that we could see with a scale like the bars. Additionally, we could have somebody who maybe behaves in such a way that it doesn't fit into any of these boxes. Okay, so they don't use measures of quality and well defined processes to achieve project goals. So we can cross off number 7. They don't look for or identify ways to continually improve the process. They don't clearly communicate quality management to others. They don't appreciate total quality management as an investment. They don't have measures of quality that define tolerance levels. They don't view quality as costly. They don't focus on only outputs and deliverables. They don't blame others for the absence of quality. They don't do any of these things. They just kind of do their job and try their best at it, right? And that doesn't really fit into any of these categories. Well, where does that fit in? I mean, I guess maybe that fits in as a 2, but what if they do that, they don't have any of these focuses, but their work quality is actually pretty high? Do they get a 2? I don't know. This is one of the challenges that we face when we use scales such as the bars. Now, who should be doing the appraisals? Now, traditionally, managers and supervisors engage in this process. And we certainly want managers and supervisors to be involved in this, all right, because they're responsible for their employees. Okay, but we're also seeing other people start to become involved in appraisals. We're starting to see peers, team members, subordinates, customers, and even self appraisals play a role in what our annual appraisals look like. And when all these components come into play, then that's what we call a 360-degree appraisal, which uses multiple sources to give us a variety of viewpoints, a variety of perspectives on somebody's performance. Now, I do want to circle back here, though, and talk about subordinates again, real quick. One thing that we have to be careful of with subordinates is that we're not interfering with the power dynamic between a manager and their subordinate by having the subordinate evaluate the manager. All right. What could happen here is maybe if a subordinate is upset about their performance review or they're upset about being held accountable for something, they might seek to quote unquote get back at the manager through the feedback that they provide. We also have to be concerned that if managers are aware that subordinates are going to be weighing in on their performance appraisals, they may treat subordinates differently around appraisal time than they do for the rest of the year. All right, because of these challenges, subordinate appraisals are often better used for developmental purposes than for administrative purposes. Now, as you think about how to give feedback during the performance appraisal, we want to remember that there's a developmental component here. And that means we need to be specific and constructive. We need to give our employees feedback that is going to allow them to improve. All right. We also need to allow them to ask questions and to respond because we may learn something from them during this process, but we also need to make sure we clarify what they're not sure about. All right. And by doing this, we're going to put them in a much better position to take their performance appraisal, respond to it, and perform better in the future. Now, the toughest appraisals to deliver are often when the employee's performance is below standards. And when this happens, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we summarize the employee's performance specifically. Okay, we need to be very clear about what the issues with their performance are. We also need to make sure that they're clear on what the expectations and standards are. They may understand what their performance is, but not know what it is that you're looking for. We want to make sure we determine causes for low performance. So, are the causes that the employee lacks knowledge? Does the employee lack the resources that they need? If we can identify these causes, then we can really use that information to help discuss solutions to the problem and come up with plans for solving the performance issue. All right, we should be able to agree between the manager and the subordinate on what the solution is, agree to a timetable, and then also document the meeting. It's very important that we document what it is that we discussed. And the reason for that is that in 6 months or 12 months, when we're looking back on whether or not, the goals that we set were achieved, we may not remember things perfectly. So by documenting the meeting, putting everything on paper and having both parties sign it, we have an agreement here as to what we discussed, what we agreed upon, and we can look back on that in the future. Now, as I mentioned before, our performance appraisals are often going to be used to help determine employee pay. All right. And there are a few different structural considerations that we're going to take into effect with employee pay. And these are internal factors and external factors. All right. So, what exactly are internal factors and external factors? Well, an external factor deals with how we're going to pay somebody compared to the market. Okay. So, if I'm trying to hire salespeople, if salespeople are all getting paid $125,000, I'm going to have to pay somewhere in that range in order to get the salespeople that I want. All right. So, maybe my salespeople are paid in that range of $125,000 because that is what the market is calling for. That's my external factor. All right, now my internal factor would be the fact that my counter help might not get anything near that, right? Like my counter help might be working in a space where they're more getting, say, $40,000 a year. All right. Now, these people are going to take a look at what my salespeople are making, and they might be somewhat upset with that. All right. They might not be very happy to see that the salespeople are making almost three times as much as what they are. Okay. And that can lead to some tensions in the workplace. And I have to figure out how to navigate that. All right. Now, I'm not going to turn around and pay my counter help what my salespeople make because they don't create the same value for us. But I've also got to recognize that I can't pay my salespeople much lower than I'm paying them, or they might go somewhere else. So this basically deals with the balance between internal factors and external factors that managers have to deal with when they're determining pay. Now we have to make some basic decisions about our pay here, and we're going to start with our pay level. Are we going to be an organization that pays above market, below market, um, at market? That would be an example of our pay level. Then we're going to look at our structure. Okay. And for our structure, we're going to have different types of positions are going to be paid differently, right? So we might have one position here is in this grade one spot, a different position here is in this grade two spot, different position here is in this grade three spot, and so on. And what each of these grades represents is a range of pay for different positions. So you could see that this grade one goes from about $7 an hour to a little over $9 an hour. All right, once we've established our structure, so we determine how we're going to pay different positions, then we have to make individual pay decisions. So if we're hiring somebody who is a top quality person for grade five and we really need to try to get them, we might offer them somewhere up here in the top. If we hire somebody for grade five and they maybe meet our needs, but they're not the best candidate out there, we might pay them somewhere in this area, a little bit below the midline. All right, but that all relates to our individual pay decisions. We also want to consider how our compensation systems are going to motivate our employees. And one way we can do that is through what we call incentive pay. All right, and individual incentive plans are designed to motivate people based upon their own performance. All right, and one company I was at, an example of an individual incentive plan that we had was a salesperson of the month bonus. And the top salesperson location would get a $100 bonus each month. Well, this certainly incentivized people to try to drive their sales a little bit higher than maybe they would have without the bonus, but it also sometimes created an unhealthy competition. At one point in time, I had one salesperson who was actually offering customers lower prices than other salespeople in the same store so that they could try to get that bonus. And that was a little bit problematic. All right. Because of this potential, our company also had group incentive plans. So we had bonuses for the entire store based upon whether or not the store hit its goals. All right. And the company set these bonuses to be a little bit higher so that people would be more focused on the group incentive than the individual incentive. And ultimately, I think it was pretty effective. I remember at one point in time when I was an hourly employee, it was my turn to unload a truck, and I went to go unload the truck, and one of my coworkers stopped me, and they said, I'll go unload the truck. And I said, yeah, but Dave, it's my turn. You want me to go? And he said, look, he said, we're really close to hitting our group bonus, and you're a better salesperson than me. I want to get that bonus. I'd rather you be up here working with customers and me unloading trucks. All right. And that's an example where the group incentive plan was really effective. All right. Now, some other types of group incentive plans that you can have are gain sharing. And this is where we look at the profits that are increased over the previous year and employees get a portion of that increase. And we have profit sharing plans. And this is where employees get a portion of the organization's profits. All right. But one of the keys that we have to make sure that we recognize with gain sharing and profit sharing plans is that employees need to understand what they mean. Okay. And what I mean by that is My first year as a manager in a specific role, my employees were getting profit sharing, and they got a really big check at the end of the year. It was the biggest one they had ever gotten. I had one employee tell me, they said, "Hey, I got $360 here, and I usually only get 40 or $50. What happened?" And I explained to him, I said, "Well, we increased our profits $400,000, so our portion of profit sharing increased tremendously. And that's why you all have profit sharing checks that are 8 to 10 times more than what you've gotten in the past." The employee was really kind of taken aback by this. All right. They knew that they got profit sharing checks, but they had no idea how their performance actually was impacting those checks. The employee came to me a few days later and said, "Hey, I've been giving you a little bit of a hard time about some of the stuff that you want us to do, but I now realize that what you're doing is you're improving the profitability of our store and helping to put more money in our pockets. So I'm not going to give you a hard time anymore." Okay, so once the employee understood what profit sharing was, it was effective, but prior to that, it wasn't. All right, we also have something called merit pay, and this is where our annual raises are based upon our appraisal scores. Under the umbrella of compensation, CEO compensation has been a fairly controversial topic over the last few years. And part of that's because there's a large gap between executives' pay and average employee pay in most organizations. And what we found is that the bigger this difference is, what we find is that there tends to be stronger firm performance in the short term, but worse in the long run. Because a lot of times, CEO compensation motivates CEOs to focus on short term gains rather than long term gains. Now, while there is a lot of criticism regarding how we compensate our CEOs, we do have to recognize, if we go back to the external factors that we discussed before, organizations are in a little bit of a bind because they have to pay a certain amount or they're not going to get a high quality CEO. So while it may seem excessive to pay what some CEOs are paid, organizations recognize that if they don't pay top dollar for CEO, they're not going to get a top quality CEO, and they may see their profitability decline. All right. So, in that sense, they're trying to maintain a balance of what is the right amount to pay a CEO and what do we have to pay in order to get somebody who's going to help us achieve the goals that we've set for our organization. In addition to base pay, employers also provide benefits for employees. Right? And there are three benefits that are required by law. The first one, workers' compensation, provides insurance for employees so that if they get injured on the job, they continue to get paid. Right? The second one, Social Security, provides a benefit for employees upon retirement. And the third one, unemployment insurance, provides a benefit for employees. It provides them with an insurance so that if they lose their job through no fault of their own, they can still receive some sort of payment. Now, what's interesting with unemployment insurance is that the rate that employers pay is based upon how many claims they have against them. So sometimes employers will fight unemployment insurance claims because they want to keep their score good so that unemployment insurance doesn't cost them too much money. All right. So this is a very tricky area, but it's very important as an employer that if you plan on fighting claims, that you have very strong documentation showing why people have been dismissed from the company. Now, other benefits such as health insurance, vision insurance, dental insurance can come in the form of what we call a cafeteria or flexible benefit program, meaning that employees can kind of pick and choose from menu what they want. All right, and the reason we have this is that different people need different things. All right, so I'm married, I have 4 kids. I need an insurance package that's going to take good care of my kids. I have 3 people in my house who wear glasses, so I need vision insurance. I have somebody in braces, so dental is very important. So for me, I pretty much will capitalize on all the types of benefits that are available. Somebody else may not need all these benefits and may choose not to pay for them. Now, as we mentioned on the previous slide, there are 3 different benefits that employers are legally required to provide for their employees in the United States of America, but those aren't the only legal requirements that employers need to be aware of. So, for example, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 prohibits unequal pay for men and women who perform the same work. There are also other laws regulating benefits, most notably ERISA, or the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and this is administered by the Employee Benefits Security Administration, a division of the U.S. Department of Labor. And what ERISA does is it basically makes sure that employers behave in such a way that they are fiscally responsible in managing employees' retirement accounts. All right. Now, there are many other laws that play a role in pay and benefits. And as HR managers, you do need to be aware of these laws and be aware of how these laws are changing as well. Employers in the United States are also legally responsible for maintaining a safe workplace. All right. And the guidelines for this legal responsibility are laid out in the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is enforced by OSHA, a division of the U.S. Department of Labor. All right. And OSHA basically requires employers to maintain records of injuries and deaths, requires employers to allow on site inspections. And it also says that employees have the right to report anything that they feel is unsafe in the workplace without fear of retaliation. The final topic that we're going to cover here in this unit deals with labor relations, or the system of relationships and interactions between workers and management. This specifically deals with how organizations interact with labor unions. Okay, and a lot of this is governed by a variety of different labor laws, such as the National Labor Relations Act, which created the National Labor Relations Board, which oversees union activity. All right, there was the Labor Management Relations Act, which permitted workers to decertify a union if they chose to do so. And there's the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, which addressed abuse by union leadership. Unionization in the workplace typically starts when a union organizer or a local rep talks to workers about benefits they can receive by joining the union. All right, and this action is protected under the National Labor Relations Act, as employees cannot be legally fired for conversing with union reps or pursuing union activity. All right, now if the union rep determines that there is enough interest, they will try to get union cards signed by employees in the location. And if 30% of the employees or more sign a union card, the National Labor Relations Board can conduct an election by secret ballot. All right. Alternatively, if more than 50% of employees sign a union card, then the employer can elect to voluntarily recognize the union. Now, there are a variety of different reasons that employees may choose to form a union. All right, economic factors and issues associated with job dissatisfaction may influence this decision, but ultimately, the driving factor between employees joining a union typically comes from the perception that they are more likely to achieve the pay and benefits that they desire with the union than they are to achieve these things without the union. Now, once employees choose to form a union, the union will negotiate on their behalf in terms of wage, benefit, hours, working conditions, so on. All right. Once the agreement is signed, the parties may actually not always agree on how to interpret the contract. And if that happens, it's typically settled through arbitration, which is a binding decision, but it does not take place through the court. All right. An outside person hears the case from both the employer and the union and makes a decision on how to interpret the contract. All right. It's important to recognize that some organizations are union shops. And what that means is that if an employee is hired by a union shop, typically within 30 days of being hired, they're required to join the union and begin paying dues. But union shops are not available in all states because some states are what you call a right to work state. And then what that basically means is that there's legislation that allows employees to work without having to join the union. Now, for all the benefits that unions do provide for employees, we are actually seeing union membership declining. Union membership is accounts for about 10.5% of the overall US labor workforce, whereas back at the end of World War II, it accounted for 33%. Now, part of this may be because Human resource management functions are a little more effective these days. And if HR managers are advocating for employees and ensuring that employees have the benefits that they need, employees may not feel like they need the union. Additionally, we've passed many more laws in the United States that help to protect employees, and these laws weren't all present when union membership first began growing. All right, that's it for our unit on human resource management. Thank you for joining me here for this lesson. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. We'll talk to you soon. I'm Billy Obnauer. Have a great day.